They said it was only the sunrise, that strange scarlet light that spilled across the Edisto River on the morning of September 9th, 1843, but the fishermen who rose early that day swore otherwise. They said the color didn't shimmer like dawn. It moved. It rippled upstream, as if the river itself was bleeding from some wound hidden in the forest's heart. The town of Stono's Crossing, forgotten now by every mapmaker and priest, was already a whisper by then. Cotton had failed. The church bells had rusted silent, and the plantation owners spoke in hushed tones of what they called the reckoning of Jemmy, a name they refused to print. Tale story they buried in ledgers burned before the war. Jemmy, a slave, a rebel, a ghost, had once led 20 men in chains through this same marsh nearly a century before. They said he'd taken 25 white settlers' heads before sunrise that Sunday, but history only remembers the first blood, not what came after. Not the days when children began vanishing from the fields, when the priest's eyes turned black in the pulpit, when the crosses burned without fire. What happened in Stono's Crossing in 1843 wasn't written down, because no one left alive could still write. And the one diary that survived was found sealed in a coffin beneath the church floor. Its first line reads, "Jemmy has returned, and this time he is patient." The diary was discovered in 1919, 76 years after the massacre that no one remembered. A group of county men had come to tear down the old St. Catherine's Chapel, what remained of it. The congregation had vanished decades earlier, leaving behind only rats, cobwebs, and the damp breath of a place that refused to die. Under the altar stone, sealed tight in a child's coffin, they found it, a book wrapped in waxed cloth, the leather swollen and black with mold. The coroner refused to touch it, said it smelled like grief. But one of the men, a school teacher from Charleston named Drury Haskins, took it home. The first pages were written in an unsteady hand, lines scratched by candlelight. "To whoever opens this, know that Jemmy walks again. His eyes are the river. His voice is the wind through the reeds. He will not die a second time." Haskins tried to dismiss it as madness, a fevered relic of slave rebellion folklore. But that night, he claimed to hear footsteps pacing beneath his floorboards, and the diary kept changing, whole paragraphs rearranged. Dates rewrote themselves. By the third night, the ink bled across the paper in fresh streaks, spelling a new message that hadn't been there before. "You found my gospel. Drury, now you must finish it." When Haskins' neighbors broke into his home a week later, they found the diary open on his desk, and his head floating in a basin of red water. They called it a diary, but it wasn't one. Not anymore. What Drury Haskins found, and what killed him, was a gospel. A new scripture written in the same looping hand that historians swore had perished in 1740. During the Stono Rebellion, each entry began with the same invocation, "In the name of the river that remembers, and the fields that drank the blood." And each one told of a man who had died in chains, then awoken in silence beneath the cotton roots, listening to the world forget him. Jemmy's words were not confessions. They were instructions. He wrote of a church that had taken his bones for holy study, bleaching them clean for display, and of priests who spoke his name in Latin, not out of reverence, but control. He described how their prayers bound his soul to the chapel, turning his torment into penance. But Jemmy, whatever he had become, had learned patience. He waited through the decades, beneath hymns and sermons, until the floorboards began to rot and the congregation thinned to whispers. Then he began speaking again, through dreams, through illness, through ink, and in the final known entry he wrote, "They took my name, I take their children." For the river must be fed again. Historians never authenticated the gospel, but every scholar who examined it shared one thing in common. Each died within 3 months, their lungs filled with river water. There were no birth records in Stono's Crossing after 1840, only death notices. Yet by every account there were children everywhere. Faces glimpsed in cornfields, voices echoing in the marsh after dark. The town's last surviving midwife, Lila Boone, told a state investigator in 1922 that she had delivered 20 infants who never learned to cry. She claimed their eyes were clouded gray, like silted river water. Their skin pale as ash. She said they grew fast, too fast, and by their 3rd year they'd stopped speaking altogether. "They watched," she said. always watched, as if waiting for something. The investigator dismissed her as delusional, but her journals, later sealed in a Charleston archive, told a different story. She wrote of finding strange marks on the children's skin, like small circular scars across their chests, always in the same place, and of how, when she traced the mark with her finger, she could feel something moving underneath. By 1845, entire families were abandoning their homes, leaving meals on tables and doors unbarred. The town priest, Father Mallory, insisted it was divine punishment for the rebellion that had once spilled white blood on holy ground. But Lila Boone's final entry, dated August 1846, tells another version. They are not punished. They are reborn. The drowned man's children walk among us, and when the river rises they will call him father again. Her house burned that same night. The marsh swallowed what was left by morning. When the diocese finally sent men to Stono's Crossing in 1847, they found Father Thomas Mallory alone inside the ruined chapel, kneeling before an altar stripped bare. He hadn't spoken in days. His fingernails were torn from scratching prayers into the wood. The men said his eyes were wild, his voice hoarse from weeping. Yet he kept repeating the same phrase, "The river forgives none." Among his belongings was a letter, unsigned, unsent, addressed to the Bishop of Charleston. It would later be catalogued simply as the Mallory Confession. In it, Mallory wrote that after the rebellion, the church had ordered him to recover what remained of Jemmy's body. The pieces were divided, the skull sent to a seminary in Savannah, the hands buried beneath the chapel steps, the heart sealed in a reliquary of glass. The relics of rebellion, he called them, but he also confessed something darker, that the relics had grown warm, that each night he found them rearranged, as if they remembered where they belonged. He described waking one dawn to the sound of breathing inside the altar. When he pried open the marble top, he saw the reliquary pulsing, as though it still beat. Mallory begged the bishop for permission to destroy it. But the church refused, calling it sacred evidence of divine judgment. His final line read, "If God demands silence, then I will scream in his place." They found his body hanging in the steeple, his tongue missing, the confession nailed to his chest. St. Audric's Seminary was a place built on silence. Its sandstone walls loomed over the Savannah River like a fortress of penance, where men came to forget the world, and the world forgot them. In 1851, the relic of Jemmy's skull was delivered there, wrapped in black velvet, accompanied by a sealed papal letter. The seminarians were told only that it belonged to a martyr of correction. The skull was placed in a glass case, displayed beside relics of saints, though its teeth were filed, and a thin fracture cut across the crown. Over the decades, the relic became a curiosity. Students whispered that sometimes, if you passed by after midnight, you could hear humming inside the reliquary, a low rhythmic drone, like someone murmuring through water. In 1879, a seminarian named Brother Gabriel began writing about it in his journal. He claimed the humming grew louder when he prayed for absolution, that when he recited the Lord's Prayer, the skull's jaw shifted ever so slightly, mouthing the words backward. He stopped attending Mass soon after. Other brothers found him kneeling before the skull, eyes rolled white, whispering a verse none could translate. When they pulled him away, his hands were covered in dark stains that smelled of mud. The next morning, the reliquary was empty. Gabriel was gone. Only the glass case remained, fogged from within. 2 days later, the river outside turned the color of rust, and every crucifix in the seminary cracked down the center. When the crucifixes split, the priests tried to call it a trick of humidity, old wood expanding, paint peeling. But the fractures were identical, thin, jagged lines running through the heart of Christ, like veins reaching toward the crossbeam. By the end of that summer, not a single holy image in St. Audric's remained whole. Statues bled resin tears, icons warped and blistered, faces melting into featureless masks. One brother swore he saw a figure behind the chapel altar, kneeling backward, its spine bending the wrong way, hands clasped in mock prayer. The bishop ordered the seminary shuttered until the corruption was cleansed. But the men who stayed behind to perform the exorcism never sent word again. Years later, a caretaker named John Nettles reopened the chapel. His testimony survives in the archives of the diocese. When I stepped inside, I saw all the crucifixes still hanging, but not one faced the altar. They'd all turned. Every cross faced the door, like they were guarding against something behind them. In the pulpit, he found a single candle still burning, though the wax had eaten through the floorboards. Beneath it, carved deep into the wood, were words in Latin and Gula intertwined. He is not beneath the river. The river is beneath him. That was the last service ever held at St. Audric's Seminary. Within a year, the building sank 6 inches into the earth, as though something beneath had exhaled. By 1883, the land where St. Audric's once stood had been repurposed. The church renamed it St. Hildegard's Home for Lost Children, an orphanage for those left behind by fever, war, and poverty. They built it directly over the sunken chapel ruins, convinced charity could sanctify cursed ground. At first, the orphanage prospered. The sisters reported docile children, quiet and obedient. Too quiet, some whispered. They would wake at dawn and sit by the windows overlooking the river, humming low, wordless songs. When asked what they were singing, they only said, "He taught us." Mother Superior Agnes began recording nightly observations. Her journals, recovered decades later from beneath the floorboards, reveal a steady descent into dread. She described strange phenomena, doors swelling with moisture, water dripping from ceilings without rain, and faint scratching beneath the dormitory floors. Once she claimed she followed the sound down into the cellar. There in the candlelight she saw muddy footprints, small, bare, childlike, leading to a sealed stone trapdoor. She wrote, "I thought it was the basement cistern. But when I pressed my ear against it, I heard whispering, hundreds of voices all reciting a prayer I have never known." 2 weeks later, Sister Agnes vanished. Her rosary was found floating in the cistern, every bead blackened and split. The children didn't cry. They simply gathered at the window, hands clasped, eyes on the river, waiting. No one was meant to open it. That's what the Masons told the bishop when they rebuilt the orphanage in 1884. The slab under the cellar was older than any structure on the property, older even than the colonial records. But when 3 children went missing that winter, the new caretaker, Samuel Brandt, decided to break it open. His account survives in a letter never mailed, found later in his coat pocket, waterlogged and almost illegible. "It wasn't stone," he wrote. "Not really. The more I struck it, the softer it became, like wet plaster. It started to breathe. Beneath the slab was a hollow tunnel lined with bones, not animal, not arranged by chance. Skulls had been embedded into the walls like decorations, their mouths filled with river mud. At the center lay a wooden cross turned upside down and nailed to it, something that might once have been human. Brandt described it as black as the bottom of a well. Its mouth was sewn shut with rosary wire. Its ribs, broken open, framed a cavity where a heart should have been. When he touched the corpse's wrist, he felt warmth. When he looked closer, the chest rose, slowly, deliberately, and a voice filled the tunnel low and calm. "You opened my church, Samuel. Now close your eyes and pray backward." The letter ends there. By morning, the trapdoor was sealed again, from the inside. The backward prayer was never written down in any scripture. It was a litany whispered in Stono's crossing by a voice older than memory, carried in the rhythm of the river and the hush of the marsh reeds. Those who heard it spoke of it only in fragments, consonants reversed, vowels hollowed, words curling upon themselves like smoke. Sister Margaret, a novice at St. Hildegard's, wrote in her journal after overhearing the children one night, "They chant in the cellars facing the river. Their tongues twist, forming words no ear should hear. I cannot tell if they call him or if he calls them." Those who attempted the prayer backwards, Samuel Brandt among them, did not survive unmarked. Witnesses describe bodies returning from St. Hildegard's after disappearing for days, only to be found wandering riverside, muttering syllables that echoed the twisted chant. Fingers were scarred, eyes clouded. Some had sores on their skin that formed strange circular patterns, like the marks of the children decades before. Local farmers began leaving offerings at the riverbank, coins, candles, old rosaries. To keep the river patient, they said, but the river never forgot. On nights when the fog rolled in thick, townsfolk reported a single figure moving through the mist, always headless, always calm. And the sound of backward syllables rose from the marsh, as though the earth itself was repeating the prayer to appease something beneath. Even decades later, when the orphanage burned to the ground and St. Audric's Seminary was abandoned, fragments of the prayer would surface. In letters, in diaries, in whispered nightmares, each one a warning: do not pray forward. It only awakens him. In 1927, long after the orphanage had closed, the remnants of St. Hildegard's were set ablaze. The local newspaper reported it as an accidental fire, perhaps a lightning strike. But those who ventured near described something impossible: flames that glowed without heat, licking the walls and windows, yet leaving the wood and plaster untouched. Witnesses spoke of shadows moving within the fire, children dancing in silence, their eyes reflecting the blaze like molten silver. One man claimed he saw a headless figure walking the perimeter, tracing the outline of the building with slow, deliberate steps. Firefighters said the temperature never rose above room temperature. They could feel it on their skin, wet and cold like standing in the river at dawn. Inside they found the same trapdoor Brandt had opened decades earlier, now cracked and oozing dark water. The cellar smelled of earth, blood, and something older, a rot that belonged neither to decay nor time. Among the scorched furniture, a single notebook lay untouched, pages filled with a backward prayer written repeatedly, as if the author had wanted the words to sink into the very grain of the building. Neighbors swore that for weeks after, the river smelled of smoke, and the fog carried faint chants. Anyone who lingered too long felt the brush of cold hands on their shoulders, urging, not threatening. By the time the fire burned itself out, though nothing truly burned, Stono's Crossing had become a place avoided by everyone, a town erased from memory, yet still alive in whispers, in river songs, in the blood of the soil. The Edisto River had always been quiet, but after Stono's Crossing disappeared, it became something else entirely. Fishermen and travelers reported the water running thicker, darker, as if it remembered every drop of blood spilled on its banks. Fish washed ashore blackened, limbs found tangled in reeds, eyes staring skyward. The locals who remained spoke in hushed tones of the river's memory. It was said to whisper names at night, calling the living to join the drowned. Children who strayed too close would return changed, silent, unblinking, following the river's rhythm like a hypnotic pulse. One story tells of a boy named Elias, taken by the river in 1932. His father, a stoic man hardened by years of toil, searched the banks for days. When he finally found him, the boy stood waist-deep in the water, murmuring the backward prayer. His eyes were grey as mud, lips peeling in concentric lines. He pointed upriver and said, "He is coming back. He always comes back." That was the last Elias ever spoke. After that, the river became a boundary no one crossed. Canoes capsized inexplicably, bridges rotted from the inside out, and the townsfolk began leaving offerings in small wooden boxes along the shore. Coins, candles, scraps of bread, anything to appease the river that remembered. Even scientists sent to investigate noted the water contained inexplicable sediment. Human and animal remains mingled in layers too deep to identify. The river held secrets older than memory itself, and perhaps older than Jemmy. The revenant whose fury had first stained the town red. It waited, patient, eternal. By the 1940s, the stories of Jemmy had transformed into legend, a tale whispered only when the wind carried the mist off the Edisto River. Yet those who encountered him described something far more. Terrifying than myth, Jemmy no longer resembled a man. Witnesses spoke of a figure taller than any human, cloaked in ragged cotton-stained dark, a face obscured by shadow. His presence was silent, yet the air trembled with it. Animals fled, dogs howled, and even the river seemed to recoil. One elderly man, Thomas Grady, claimed to have seen him in 1941 while hunting near the old orphanage site. He stood there where the water meets the trees. I could see my own death in his eyes, and not just mine, but everyone who ever wronged him. I swear he wasn't moving, but the trees bent away from him. Like the world feared his touch, Jemmy's hands, long and spindly, carried the memory of the massacre. 25 skulls carved into the knuckles of one, his fingernails split and blackened. The air around him reeked of iron and silt, of blood long forgotten but not forgiven. Children who wandered too close to the river sometimes returned, speaking his name backward. Adults who dared cross him disappeared without a trace, leaving only footprints in mud that led toward the river and ended abruptly, as if he had stepped into another world. Jemmy was patient. He had been patient for nearly a century, and now the river, the orphanage, the seminary, the cracked crucifixes, all bowed to his slow, relentless return. In 1944, a team of government surveyors was sent to Stono's Crossing to chart the Edisto River for potential flood control projects. They arrived with instruments, notebooks, and the hubris of men who believed the land could be measured, controlled, and understood. They never returned. Weeks later, a search party found their equipment scattered along the marsh. Compasses spun wildly, chains tangled as if writhing in the mud, notebooks soaked in water and smeared with dirt. One journal had pages missing, torn with precision. Yet the words "he waits" were repeatedly scrawled backward on what remained. The river held no bodies. The forests yielded no signs of struggle. Only footprints, human at first, then elongating unnaturally, fading into the water, as if someone had walked into the river and become one with it. Locals reported strange phenomena in the weeks following: distant voices calling names no one alive remembered, ripples in the river when the wind was still, and children seen wandering alone at dusk, humming the backward prayer. One old man told investigators, "The river takes them, but it isn't finished with them." When the fog comes, you can see the shapes, the heads turned wrong, floating just below the surface, looking up. After this, Stono's Crossing was erased from maps. The land itself seemed to reject habitation, swallowing roads, collapsing foundations, and reclaiming fields. Jemmy had returned, and his hunger was patient, not for blood alone, but for memory, for acknowledgement, for the world to remember what it had forgotten. The families of Stono's Crossing vanished quietly, one by one, leaving only the echoes of their lives behind. Letters remained unopened on mantelpieces, rocking chairs swayed in empty homes, and kitchens held cold meals that no one would eat. Yet the town's secrets did not vanish with them. They lingered like shadows pressed against the walls, waiting for recognition. Some historians later pieced together fragments: the O'Neills, the Greys, the Duvals. Each family had members who vanished without cause, often children first. The adults remained for months, tending fields or tending animals, until one morning they simply walked into the fog and never returned. Local legend says the river claimed them, but the truth was more insidious. Jemmy's reach extended beyond the banks, beyond the marshes, into memory itself. Families forgot their own names, their pasts, even the faces of their children. They became husks wandering the edges of the land, unable to tell one another what had happened, unable to leave the town because leaving required memory, and memory had been stolen. Those who tried to leave remembered only fragments: a whisper of a parent, a glimpse of a child's grey eyes, a backward syllable carried on the wind. The backward prayer became a kind of family curse. Any attempt to resist it resulted in silence, or disappearance, or worse, a slow creeping transformation into something not entirely human. By the 1930s, no living descendants remained in Stono's Crossing. Yet the river still bore witness, remembering every family, every name, every act of violence that history had chosen to forget. St. Catherine's Chapel was never rebuilt, yet its shadow remained, a silent, oppressive presence over Stono's Crossing. The church, in its wisdom and fear, claimed the land sacred and untouchable, burying records, burning ledgers, and denying the town's existence to every historian who asked. Inside, it is said, the floorboards hid more than the diary of Jemmy. Beneath the altar lay a lattice of relics, bones, and ancient chains. Every piece told a story of violence, despair, and unacknowledged rebellion. The priests who cared for the chapel insisted it was for the sake of order, for spiritual correction. But in truth it was fear, fear of what Jemmy had become, fear of what the river remembered, fear that truth might demand vengeance. Archival fragments show letters sent from Charleston and Savannah, requests for absolution, confessions of unnatural occurrences, and orders to keep silence. Yet the letters themselves were intercepted, rewritten, or burned. By 1920, the church had fully embraced erasure. Townsfolk who questioned the past were dismissed as deluded or simply disappeared. Still, some witnesses survived. They spoke of candles flickering along the river at night, casting shadows in the shapes of crucifixes bent backward. They said murmurs echoed from the ruins of the chapel, carrying prayers no priest had ever taught, and that the river seemed to answer in kind. Swelling with memory, the church had buried its sins, but it could not bury Jemmy nor the river, nor the backward prayers that tied both together in eternal reckoning. In 1938, a small group of academics from Charleston University arrived in Stono's Crossing, armed with notebooks, magnifying glasses, and the certainty of rational men. They came to study the whispers of madness, the stories of missing children, backward prayers, and a town erased from maps. Dr. Elias Renwick, the lead scholar, documented what he called collective delusions at first. But by the third day, he had begun to question his own sanity. At night, he wrote, I hear them, hundreds of voices chanting not in words but in tones that my mind cannot translate. They call my name and I feel compelled to answer. The river has memory and it remembers me. The scholars attempted to map the terrain, chart the river, interview the remaining locals. Each experiment failed. Instruments malfunctioned. Compasses spun as if dizzy with fear. When they followed the riverbank, footprints appeared behind them, identical to their own, then disappeared into the water. One student, Clara Whitmore, disappeared entirely. Her notebook was found a week later, floating in the river. Its pages scrawled with the backward prayer and a single line repeated obsessively. He is patient. We are patient. We are the river. Dr. Renwick burned the notebook in a fit of desperation, but the next morning the fire had consumed nothing, leaving the river-smoothed pages intact. By the end of their visit, the scholars had learned the truth too late. Stono's Crossing could not be studied, understood, or measured. It could only be remembered, and remembered backward, like a prayer no one should ever speak. The fog came suddenly, thick as wool, and lingered over Stono's Crossing for weeks in the early 1940s. It was unlike any natural mist. It carried sound, voices that could not be traced to any human mouth. Some claimed it spoke in the old Gullah tongue. Others said it repeated the backward prayer over and over, faster and faster, until the words were indecipherable. Residents who wandered into it reported hallucinations, trees with faces screaming silently, water reflecting events that had never happened, shadows moving against the wind. Some spoke of glimpsing Jemmy within the fog, headless or faceless, standing in the river, beckoning with a crooked hand. One man, a fisherman named Paul Herrick, claimed he heard his own death foretold. I walked into the fog at dawn. The river called my name. 1,000 mouths spoke at once, and I saw myself lying on the shore, eyes grey as silt. He was never seen again. The fog did more than obscure the land. It restructured it. Roads curved unnaturally. Trees grew twisted. Houses leaned toward the river as if listening. Even those who remained inside felt it pressing through walls, wrapping the air around them like wet cloth. By the end of the month, the town's remaining families either fled or vanished, and the fog receded, leaving behind a landscape scarred with memory, haunted by whispers and fertile with the river's patience. In Stono's Crossing, the fog is not forgotten. It remembers, it listens, and it speaks, always backward, always patient, always waiting for the next to answer its call. By 1947, Stono's Crossing existed only in whispers and half-burned maps. Henry Caldwell, a cartographer from Charleston, was tasked with updating river charts for navigation. He had heard the stories of missing children, backward prayers, the headless revenant, but he dismissed them as superstition. He arrived with surveying tools, measuring tape, and a compass that refused to point north. The land itself seemed to resist him. Paths he mapped one day would vanish the next. Trees rearranged themselves. The river would swell overnight, carrying away the soil he had measured. Caldwell recorded in his journal that he saw footprints in the mud, human at first, then grotesquely elongated, leading toward the river. And when he followed them, they disappeared into water that seemed impossibly still. At night, Caldwell began hearing whispers in his tent. The voices were patient, insistent, reciting the backward prayer. Every syllable carried memory of massacres, of vanished children, of crucifixes cracked long ago. I am writing this to whoever may read it, he wrote on November 3, 1947. The town is not gone. It cannot be gone. It waits in the river, in the fog, in the soil. And he, Jemmy, waits, patient, eternal. Caldwell's maps were found months later. They depicted Stono's crossing. But the roads twisted impossibly, rivers ran uphill, and every location was marked with a single warning: do not awaken what sleeps beneath. He was never seen again. No one knows when Jemmy truly returned. Some say it was the day the river turned red in 1843. Others whisper it happened every time a child vanished, a priest fell silent, or a mapmaker's compass spun in madness. By 1950, the legend was no longer just a story. It had become law, a slow, inescapable rhythm in the bones of the land. The final reckoning was not sudden. It came like the tide, relentless, patient, and absolute. The river rose without rain, covering roads, fields, and cemeteries alike. Fog rolled in thicker than ever, swallowing anything that dared breathe its air. Those who lingered saw shapes in the mist. Faceless children. Crucifixes bent backward, figures taller than men, cloaked in ragged cotton, Jemmy's revenant form, surveying the land he had claimed. Survivors, if they can be called that, speak of a sensation that cannot be escaped, a weight pressing against memory, twisting it backward, as if every forgotten sin, every buried truth, were clawing its way back to the surface. The river sings in the night, carrying every voice, every backward prayer, every footstep that has ever vanished into the marsh. The land remembers, and Jemmy waits, patient, eternal. He waits for recognition, for fear, for acknowledgement of the debts never repaid. And in the dark corners of America, in every river bend and fog-laden marsh, his presence lingers, a reminder that some horrors are too deep, too old, too insistent to ever be forgotten. History erased Stono's crossing, but the river remembers. And Jemmy? He has never forgiven,